Hello, this is Sam Gerrans. Today is Sunday, 27th of March, 2022, and this is my new project, truthinthenews.info. Now, the point of this channel is really going to be to unpick how media works, just taking apart a few articles and just seeing how the misdirection and manipulation operates. The reason why I know about this is because I happen to work at one point in my life in public relations. I've also worked to a certain extent in media and journalism, and have been around a lot of journalists, as you will be if you work in public relations. And the reason why I'm doing this is really in support of the Russian position vis-a-vis Ukraine and all the rest of it. So that's what this is for, and it's really to help Westerners be aware of the type of media manipulation and crafting of narratives that they're under. Now, I can't go through every single instance of this, but I can teach you how to read an article, how to see what's going on, how to ask the kind of questions that will not necessarily bring you to my conclusions, but at least will give you something to work with. The reason why this is called truthinthenews.info, just very briefly, it's from a joke, a Soviet joke actually, about the newspapers. The main two newspapers in the Soviet period were Pravda, which means truth, and Izvestia, which means news. And the joke was that there's no truth in the news and no news in the truth. I hope to sort of put some of that right here. Now, part of what I'm going to be doing is looking at articles, and also I hope to be also interviewing competent, informed people, not just about this, but to sort of build around, give Westerners some sort of access or more access, because I know there's a lot of information out there, to what's really going on the ground vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis the entire attempt to basically cancel Russia, which is what's going on now. That's by way of introduction. Today, what we're going to be looking at is an article that I saw a couple of days ago from I think it's in The Guardian. Let's just have a quick look at it. I'm going to pull that up here, and I'll put a link to it. No, it's The Independent. I'll put a link to it down below. It's short, but we're going to just kind of go through it and unpick what it's really doing. Now, the article is called Some Prominent Russians Quit Jobs, refuse to support war. So what they're doing there is they're connecting that somebody's quit their job on the one hand, and insinuating they're making a link between that and some sort of inferred refusal on their part to support war. Because what this article is doing, this is propaganda. I'm not saying it's this article. You could argue that to some extent all media is propaganda. I wouldn't even really disagree with that. But what we're doing is just looking at this particular piece. So what this is doing, it's connecting two ideas in the mind of the reader, that someone has quit their job, someone is prominent, someone prominent in the Russian government or Russian milieu, and what they're trying to do is to sow in the mind of the reader the impression that there is some sort of dissent or major dissent in the Russian camp. That's what this is trying to do, and we'll just see why. I'm not so interested in whether it's true or not, although perhaps we'll touch on that. What I really want to do is to hit what's going on here. Now, to read, the resignation of Anatoly Chubais, who was President Vladimir Putin's envoy to international organizations for sustainable development, was not the first resignation of a state official over the war with Ukraine, but it was one of the most striking. Now, this is well-crafted propaganda. What they're doing here is, firstly, what we're looking for is key words, international organizations. So clearly this is a very prominent, a very high and important person. And it's true, Anatoly Chubais certainly was rich. That's true. And we'll get to who he really was in a minute. International organizations for sustainable development. Now, you may not be aware, but not everyone cares about the environment in the same way as they do in the West. In the West, the environment is really a kind of a god. It's something has to be worshipped. And a lot of people in the West have the idea that everybody else thinks the same way. They don't. They really don't. In fact, a lot of people in the West don't think this way. We understand that this is certainly here in Russia, that of course, one has to look after one's environment to a certain extent, but it's not the cult here, at least yet, that it is in the West. So to say that someone is, what does it say here, envoy to international organizations for sustainable development may be very impressive in the West, but not so much here. Was not the first resignation of a state official over the war with Ukraine. Now, what this is really pointing to is the idea that lots of state officials are leaving, and this is a trickle turning into a flood. That's the idea. But it was one of the most striking I see. So this is one of the most important out of this unnamed but implied stream of defections. That's what this is doing. This is, I would say, in terms of propaganda, it's quite clear what its payload is. Propaganda has a payload. It's clear what the payload is here, and it's written. It's not very subtle, but it's not the worst that you can get. Now, what is this? This is The Independent. So this is The Independent used to be for intelligent people. Now, I hope I don't sound too awful here, but really we're not dealing with intelligence anymore. What we're dealing with, certainly in the West, is with emotions, and that's what this is geared towards. Anyway, let's jump into the actual article, which is quite short, and we'll get through it in a few minutes. The resignation of a senior Russian government official and his reported move abroad wasn't the first voluntary departure of a person from a state job since the start of Russia's war with Ukraine, but it was certainly one of the most striking. So this is, as it were, the kind of the lead line, and it's referencing what we've already seen from the tagline above. Now, Anatoly Chubais, who was President Vladimir Putin's envoy to international organizations on sustainable development, which repeats what we saw above, is well known in Russia. Well, that much is true. Yes, that bit's true. He is well known in Russia. I believe he was the president of the electric company. I'm not quite sure what position he held more recently than that. He's certainly well known in Russia. That bit is true. He held high-profile posts for nearly 3 decades, beginning under Boris Yeltsin, the first post-Soviet leader. Well, that's not as true as it seems, or would appear to be at first blush. He's not a high member of the government, as we'll see as we continue. A number of public figures have condemned the invasion of Ukraine and left their posts at state-run institutions and companies. Yes, this is true. This is what Chubais was more connected with, state-run institutions and companies. He wasn't a high-ranking member of the government. This is not true, which could signal division in Russia's official ranks over the war. This is where they're going with this. This is what they're pushing to. Now, I'm not here to argue that high-ranking Russians are or are not on board or not on board with this. What I am arguing is that this piece of writing is designed to place in the mind the idea that this is the case, but it's not presenting any evidence. What it's doing is it's plucking at particular emotions and implying evidence that it isn't presenting. And once you become aware of this, when you've written some of this sort of stuff, you become inured to it. But most people aren't really aware of it, and you need to be aware of what's actually going on, no matter what the source is, whether it's Russian media or Western media. But we'll just pick this apart, a few more bits, and see where we are. So far, there have been no indications that the resignations have reached into Putin's inner circle. But the implication is that they're going in that direction. You see? No evidence, just innuendo. This is how it works. This is how propaganda works. And this is propaganda. There's no question about it. The handful of departures came as Putin blasted those opposing his course as, quote, scum and traitors, end quote, which Russian society would spit out, quote, like a gnat. Now, this is association. There may be an association between these two events. There may not be. We don't know. But the article is implying that there is. And again, we're dealing with emotions, and people aren't taught logic now. They're mainly unable to distinguish feelings from facts. And the feeling that one would gain from reading this is that there is a connection, that Russia has, that Chubais is, as it were, a gnat or a scum and traitor as seen by Russia, and has been spat out personally by Putin from the country. That's the kind of impression that one is given here. Okay, let's continue. Some of the high-profile figures who have turned their backs on the Kremlin because of the war, and now they list them. Now we're just going to look at Anatoly Chubais, and again the idea here, and Anatoly Chubais is the best that they've got here. What they want to do is create an impression of a, as I say, of a stream turning into a flood, turning into a tsunami of if not rats leaving the ship, at least the sailors jumping overboard. That's what they want you to gain. And the question though is this what they really have? I would argue that it isn't. Let's continue. So, Anatoly Chubais. On Wednesday, the Kremlin confirmed media reports about the resignation of Chubais, 66, who was the architect of Yeltsin's privatization campaign. Now, this is a fact, and this is correct. Anatoly Chubais is 66 years old. That is true. What is also true is that he was one of the architects of Yeltsin's extremely unpopular process of privatization, which happened about 2 decades ago. This was the last time that Anatoly Chubais was really a really prominent figure in Russian politics, 20 years ago, even more. Okay, so, but they're not giving you that impression. If they'd said someone who was a big shot in Russia 25 years ago has left the country, he's 66 years old, he resigned and left, that would be a true summary of the facts. But what they're trying to do is link this with other things that it may or may not be linked with. I'm not exactly arguing that they're not linked with these things. I'm saying that they're not presenting the evidence, and what they're doing is they're using innuendo and basically manipulation to imply something that they're not providing the evidence for. And once you become aware of this, alive to this, you'll see that this is in everything. To continue, the reports citing anonymous sources said he stepped down because of the war. I repeat that. The reports, i.e. Now, what reports are we talking about here specifically? Media reports. Well, what media reports are those? Which the Kremlin has confirmed. They're linking to non-linked events, which themselves cited anonymous sources. All right? Just see how far back this goes. An anonymous source is, in media speak, it means it's made up, okay? That's kind of what it means. So, or it's a bit like if you read not very well written, popular sort of conspiracy books, which say things like, researchers think. Well, which researchers? Who specifically, and what exactly is it that they said, and where did they say it? This is... I guess you could also say it's like some people think. It is asserted. It means nothing. You can't use this in any real sense. That's what I'm trying to get to. So anonymous sources. This, when you break it down, it's laughable. But if you read this without digesting what it's doing, it's highly pernicious. And the reason why I'm doing this is because the effect of all of this propaganda is death. This isn't innocuous. This is supporting death. Lots of it in Ukraine, of people, Ukrainians and Russians, and therefore it needs to be addressed, because the hysteria that's being whipped up in Russia against, in the West against Russians in general, will not age well. Let's just, be aware that the West has been claiming for at least 100 years to be the bastion of democracy and fairness and equity and whatever it means by that. And those things change all the time. But as I speak, and today is Sunday the 27th of March, there are apparently tens of thousands of people today marching in London in support of what is largely in Ukraine a Nazi regime. We have libtards, the kind of people who read this stuff, marching for Nazism. So this kind of media, and this is a very small instance of it, is having an effect on people who don't control their own minds. So it's a good idea to learn how to read this sort of stuff intelligently, because it's supporting a system of murder. Okay, to continue. There's not much more left. Under Yeltsin, Chubais reportedly... let's back up a little bit. The reports, these anonymous reports, citing anonymous... these unclear reports citing anonymous sources, so we're at least 2 steps away from anything that you could even relate as being reality, and no evidence, of course, said he stepped down because of the war. So did he say that he'd stepped down because of the war? No, he didn't. Somebody heard somebody who thought that somebody said that that's what he said. Again, Chubais is not a major government figure. He was 25 years ago, but he's not now. And he is 66 years old. This is true. And yes, he's left the country. That's also true. What's also true is a lot of people are very glad to see the back of Anatoly Chubais. What is true is that, in case you don't know, is that the whole persecution of oligarchs, which the West has embarked upon, is this is a present wrapped in a bow for Putin. You've just solved the big problem. The idea is that Putin is working hand in glove with the oligarchs. That's not the case. Putin's very, very glad to see the back of the oligarchs. So thank you for sorting that problem out. And Chubais really was connected with the creation of the oligarchs, because that's what privatization did. So I can't speak myself to why Anatoly Chubais has left Russia, but an informed guess on my part would be that he's not very popular in Russia anymore, now that the actual oligarchs are losing their power thanks to the West, and he's done the smart thing, which is get out of Dodge. That's what's actually happened, but they're painting this in a completely different light. So let's just carry on. He hasn't publicly commented on his resignation. Well, no, that's true. He hasn't said anything about it at all. That bit's true. Under Yeltsin, Chubais reportedly recommended the administration hire Putin, a move that was widely seen as an important stepping stone in Putin's career. Now, what this bit is here to sort of imply, quite subtly, is that Chubais is extremely important because he's the man who made Putin. This may or may not be true. I think it's not true. Even if it had been true at some time, it doesn't mean anything now. Okay? This is all innuendo. This is all inference. It's not reality. It's smoke and mirrors. To continue. Putin became president of Russia in 2000 when Yeltsin stepped down. That bit's true. the 2000 was, as everyone knows, 22 years ago. So whatever influence Chubais had over Putin, that's long gone. Chubais was also deputy prime minister from 1994 to 1996. Now, that's true, but what is also true is that Russia has an awful lot of deputy prime ministers. It's not like it's one thing. There's quite a number of these guys. And first deputy prime minister from 1997 to 1998. That is true. And I believe there is just one first deputy prime minister, but there have been 16 of them since the time that Anatoly Chubais held that post, just to put it into some sort of context. So we're going to finish up here. The Russian business newspaper Kommersant reported Wednesday that Chubais was seen in Istanbul this week and ran a photo of a man resembling him at a Turkish ATM. Yeah, that may be true. Perhaps he is there. What is true, just to summarize, is a 66-year-old man who, called Anatoly Chubais, has left Russia and, let's say, is now in Turkey. Since the start of the invasion, now this is a word, invasion, that I agree with. Of course, Russia calls it a special operation. You can understand why they're doing that. I think it's to do with the associations of invasion, which we tend to see as operations of occupation. This is not an occupation mission, and so I understand why Russians are not using the word, or Putin is not using the word invasion. However, in more natural language, it is an invasion, certainly at this point. But since the start of the invasion, Istanbul has taken in many Russians looking to relocate. So again, the idea is here that there's this stream of people leaving Russia. Chubais is sort of riding this tsunami of grand exodus of Russia's brightest and best, and that's what this article is about. Now, I'm just going to wrap this up by saying certainly people have left Russia. As far as I can see, there are really 2 or 3 main categories. I'll just briefly talk about that and then we'll wrap this up. The first is Ukrainians in Russia who, and I've talked about this on my other channel, but very briefly, Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. You might find Ukrainians that would disagree with that right now because of what's been happening, and also because they've been indoctrinated at school level in the philosophy of what is essentially Nazism. It's in the school books. And there is a feeling amongst a lot of Ukrainians, not all Ukrainians by any means, but a lot of Ukrainians, of rabid hatred towards Russians. Now, speaking anecdotally, I've lived in Russia for 20 years. I've never met, actually, a Russian who evinces that kind of hatred towards Ukrainians. That isn't the feeling here at all. The feeling here at all is that this is a very unfortunate, terrible thing. And to some extent, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but to a certain extent, there's a compassion and feeling for the Ukrainians. Obviously, there's a preference for Russians, but for Ukrainians too. There's certainly no sort of, that I've seen, straining at the leash to kill Ukrainians. That's not what I see here. Now, going back to the Exodus thing, which this article is trying to sort of touch on. Certainly, some Ukrainians have left Russia, and I think, and this is a guess, that I think they thought that the West would keep its word to Ukraine, and that they would get taken in to the European community, or the EU, and into NATO, and that they would get Western, citizenship, etc. That could be part of it. I can certainly understand if your homeland is under attack, that you feel you kind of have to choose, and but it's certainly not the case. And briefly, I would respect that. I don't respect people like the Azov brigades and so on, but I certainly understand protecting your homeland, even in the circumstances which I'm not going to get into now. But in my view, Russia has no choice but to do what it's doing. Absolutely none whatsoever. Its hand was forced. I haven't seen many wars that are necessary in my life. I'm 54 years old and I've seen a whole load of them. But this is justified. This is an existential question for Russia, existential. And we'll get into it in other shows. So I understand and respect that Ukrainians might leave Russia, but there has been another sort of slew of people who've left. And these are people who are more Western leaning, and it was really sudden. They just sold their flats or rented them out or whatever it is. But a lot of people sold and fled. They went. And the reason is for this, in my view, is we've had major crises in Russia before. I mean, in the West, since the Second World War, you've only really had one, and that's COVID. In Russia, we've had a ton. We understand crises. They tend to sort of merge one into another. So it's not anything new here. And I think that they thought that they kind of had to choose. And so they made their choice and they decided to go with the West. I would imagine that they're regretting it now, especially as things develop. I think they may regret it more. Maybe not. But in a way, I feel sorry for them. Can you imagine having left Russia at a time like this to go and live in, let's say, France or Germany or England, only to find that within a week, the populations of those countries had been whipped up into a hysteria whereby you're now the enemy, you've left your homeland and can't really return. And the reason why you can't really return, or certainly you couldn't return to your own city, is because everybody will know that you left. And, that will have social consequences, rightly so. Going back to what Putin said about spitting out gnats and so on. So those people have left, and these are people who I suppose who sympathise, with Western values, and what Western values really are has been exposed brutally in the last month or two, because the West has always claimed the certain postulates, innocent until proven guilty, property rights, contract. All that's out the window now. So what have you got left? Well, all you've got left is hysteria, articles like this, which is what feeds this kind of thing, emotions, and, the next thing that everybody is going to get, on a witch hunt about, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Russians are evil, or whether, 5-year-olds have a right to decide to transition into a penguin without their parents' knowledge or consent. The West is in a downward spiral, and I'm not Lord Haw here or anything like that, and I'm not sort of a kind of a fanboy exactly for Putin. It's not about that for me. I'll talk in another issue of this channel why I'm doing this. I have spoken about it on my other channel, but I'm not going to get into it right now. But I have reasons for what I'm doing, and it's nothing to do with my feelings, particularly about the leadership in this country. It's because I believe that what the West is doing is evil. And what I mean by that is that this process of lying is not just in support of a war. And we understand that, truth is the first victim of war and all the rest of it. This is more than that. And it's become personal for me. So that's why I'm doing this. I also think that, that there's a certain amount of Russians who speak good English, let's say, who live in the West, who might pick this up and would like to have this perspective, have a means of sharing this kind of perspective with their Western friends, because being an Englishman myself, I suppose in a way it makes it more accessible to those people. But it's not a matter for me of being a mindless Russophile or anything like that. That's not what this is about. Anyway, I'll link to this article in the drop down below, and I hope to be able to post a really good interview sometime tomorrow or the next day, but I'm going to keep that under my hat. Thanks to everyone for listening. I'm Sam Gerrans from truthinthenews.info, and this show accepts no advertising, nor is it affiliated with any government or company, and its content is copyright free. Truthinthenews.info is supported entirely by voluntary contributions, so see truthinthenews.info if you would like to help keep this boat afloat. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications to get the next thing the moment it happens. And that's all for now.